Oh, I had it. Oh, I hope that wasn't too loud. We might have to kick out our dog. Hey, Mike, could you please kick the dog out?
Well, I completely agree with the philosophy of wolf.
Please don't unmute. I am lighting the candle, and for the chalice lighting, I'm going to read a quote by Pope John Paul II. Faced with the widespread destruction of the environment, people everywhere are coming to understand that we cannot continue to use the goods of the earth as we have in the past. A new ecological awareness is beginning to emerge. The ecological crisis is a moral issue. That was, again, said by Pope John Paul II, December 8th, 1989. For my reading, I'm going to read a poem that I found. Normally, this is a video that was done, and the video is amazing. And if you enjoy the way that the poem is, then I would be very happy to share the video. I had shared that on our Facebook NCUU. This is called both The Gift and an Imagined Letter from COVID-19 to Humans by Kristen Wentz. Stop. Just stop. It is no longer a request. It's a mandate.
Oh. What? Recording. Why isn't our picture up there?
I erased it. I mean, I muted it.
Okay. An A too.
Is that unmuted?
It says.
Sorry, can't hear anything.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you,
Yes,
Joe.
yes.
I think we lost Amy. She's not on the screen any longer either.
Who's that? Janice Woldridge.
Roger and Sally can hear everybody, but we don't hear Amy or see her.
Yeah.
Amy seems to have disappeared for some reason. I'm sure she'll realize that and log back on. I hope.
Might be the internet goofing up.
In the meantime, is our speaker here?
Yes, he is. Dennis Woolridge is his name, and he's a friend of Amy's, but I don't have any other information on him right now.
We know he's here.
So
he's right there. Dennis, why don't you introduce yourself and provide that information?
Okay, that's not a problem. I can do that. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
As you have all discovered, my name is Dennis Woolridge. As far as finding out more information about me, may I suggest the post office wall? Just kidding. Today, I don't even have the intro that I sent to Amy, so I have no idea what I told her. It was a little bit of a biographical background, but I am a product of the public education systems of Missouri and Illinois. Don't hold that against me. I spent 4 years as a Navy journalist and spent the rest of my working career as a production person in the television industry, working at Channel 9 in Orlando, Florida. What I wanted to talk to you about today is the idea of the Dark Ages. And what I really want to share with you eventually is an excerpt from James Michener's book, Space. It meant a great deal to me when I read it back in 1983, and I hope that it means a great deal for you too. Of course, my Kindle keeps turning off on me, so we'll see if this actually works or not. So in order to understand the idea of, are we entering a second dark age, or are we entering a dark age, I think it helps a little bit to understand what the dark ages were. And many scholars today, many historians and people who believe that they know a great deal about that period of time refuse to use the word dark ages. They think it's a negative connotation. And I can understand that. They prefer the term Middle Ages. But basically, it was a period of time from the 5th to the 14th century between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. And the unusual thing about it is only occurred in Western Europe. Globally, the period was a time of exploration and discovery. The New York Times published an article called "Shall the Dark Ages Return?" on July 3rd, 1863. And as many of you realize, that was during the Civil War. In the article, the question was asked, what was the Dark Ages? It was the limitation of thought. The Saturday Review says very correctly, those ages were dark because, quote, the thought and feelings of men worked in the same groove, and everything outside that groove was ignored. The men who lived then were straitened by the limitations, or limited by the limitation of thought. They were not allowed to cultivate new fields and wander into regions of discovery and new theories of philosophy. It is not possible that civilization may again limit thought by insisting that only practical and material items can be considered. For no observing person will deny that such is the tendency of our times. In the Dark Ages, hundreds and thousands of scholars were occupied in deciphering old, musty Latin manuscripts and commenting on the fathers. They were trying to find out what other people did and not entering upon new intellectual enterprises for themselves. And I don't think I've ever read a better description of what that period of time was like in Western Europe. Now, to give you a little more background on myself, I am a voracious reader and a constant student. I have filled most of my reading hours for the last 65 years with fiction rather than nonfiction. And I found a great number of truths within the pages of novels. None were more jarring to me than what I read in 1983. Space by James Michener was published the year before, and as soon as it was available by my by mail book club, many of you probably belonged to those in that period of time, I grabbed it up. Always a space enthusiast, both human exploration and astronomy, I was eager to read the book. It's the story of a fictional group of astronauts and various other characters. It begins in the waning years of the Second World War, and it continues through the time in which it was published in the mid-'80s. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Michener, his books tend to be epic in nature, and at 622 pages, space was not the exception to the rule. And I was even thinking about taking a break from the book when I read what I wish to share with you this morning. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background before I read this excerpt. The main character in the book is an astronaut by the name of John Pope. And it follows him from his latter years in high school through his retirement from NASA. And also a little bit of background on the events that were surrounding this particular part of the book. There's a con man by the name of Strabismus who has convinced everyone that things like evolution and climatology and geology and the historical references to the more ancient parts of Earth's history should all be eliminated. And in fact, a vote has just been held in the fictional state of Fremont, and the people have decided that they agree with him. And all of these things are currently being excised from the educational system, from schools. And that's what's going on at the time of this reading, of this section of the book. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to read for you now. It was into this heated atmosphere that John Pope returned, and there was general apprehension when the university announced that its most beloved professor emeritus, Carl Anderson, who had taught John Pope astronomy, would give the major address at this celebration. Anderson was a very old man now, and it was cause to fear that he might ramble on, and possibly that although he had not participated in the fight against Strabismus, he might speak unguardedly and open old wounds. The officials were relieved, therefore, when Anderson said, "I will give my speech honoring John in the planetarium." Well, the space is small enough, the president of the university assured the board, so that the rabble can't force their way in. They convened at 8 in the evening, and the intellectual cream of the community, many of whom had voted to outlaw evolution and geology, though they were not fanatics, they wanted to hear what the old man had to say. And as he took the stage in the planetarium, he said, "Tonight is the 22nd of June, 1976. When the lights go down, we shall see the heavens as they are currently outside the planetarium. Now I'm going to turn the sky clock back to 922 years ago. It is again June 2nd in 1054. The sky looks almost exactly as it does tonight. A few planets, different positions, that's about all. I'm going to speed through the 18 days, and here we have the heavens as they appeared at sunset on the night of 10 July, 1054. Let's go to midnight in Baghdad, where Arabic astronomers are looking at the sky as they always did. There's nothing unusual. Let's move forward a little bit to the 11th of July, 1054, towards 3 in the morning. And there's still nothing exceptional. But look, there in the constellation of Taurus, the silence of the planetarium watched in awe as extreme brilliant light began to emerge from the far tip of the bull's horns. It exceeded anything else in the heavens, infinitely brighter than even Venus, and increasing in brilliance each moment. The old man continued. It was a supernova in the constellation Taurus, and we know the exact date because Arabic astronomers in many countries saw it and made notes confirming the sightings that were made in China. The Indians in Arizona saw it and marveled, and in the South Pacific, natives marked the miracle and watched as daylight comes to 1054. The new star is so bright that it can be seen even against the rays of the sun, which is not far off in Cancer. For 23 days, astronomers of Cathay and Araby tell us that this supernova dominated the sky, almost as bright as the sun, the most incandescent event in the recorded history of mankind. No other nova has even come close to this one. Look at it, challenging even the sun. Watch how it commands the night sky, this flaming beacon. He allowed the planetarium to run rather slowly, recreating the cycle of the 23 unequal days. When watchers throughout the world had been stunned by this miracle. By day, by night, it filled the planetarium so that Penny and John Pope could see each other with its radiance and the faces of all those around them. And then, on the evening of the second day of August, 1054, the great new star diminished, fading with a speed even more precipitous than that which it had arisen, until Taurus looked as it had for 1,000 years and would look for 1,000 years thereafter. The old man said, "Why do I tell you these things on the night that we honor our cherished son, John Pope? For one simple reason. This great star, which must have been the most extraordinary light in the history of the heavens during mankind's observations, was noted in China, in Arabia, in Alaska, in Arizona, and in the South Pacific, for we have their records to prove it. But in Europe, nobody saw it. From Italy to Moscow, from the Urals to Ireland, nobody saw it, or at least they made no mention of it. They lived through one of the Earth's most magnificent spectacles, and nobody even bothered to note the fact on any parchment or speculated upon it in any manuscript. We know the event took place because telescopes tonight we can see the remnants of the supernova hiding in Taurus. but we have searched every library in the Western world, and without ever finding a single shred of evidence that the learned people of Europe even bothered to notice what was happening around them. An age is called dark, not because the light fails to shine, but because people refuse to see it. When I read those words, I was taken aback. I remember setting the book down on my desk and just sitting and pondering that for a moment. An age is called dark, not because the light refuses to shine, but because people do not see it. And it has made me wonder since then, and especially in the days that we live in now, how much of that are we experiencing today? How much is it that we allow those who are in charge to tell us what we are to believe, to tell us what we're to think? We've let science slip into the background of our lives. Things like climate change. You know, climate change is nothing new. I remember back when I was in junior high school, you know, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, that a friend of mine and I would go and sit with a science teacher at my junior high school, and we would talk about some of the current events. And one of those was the fact that not too long before that, there had been probes sent by the United States and Russia to the planet Venus. Venus had always been thought to be a sister planet of Earth. It was shrouded in clouds. And because there were clouds, and it was the only other planet that had clouds that we knew of at that time, it was thought that Venus would be very much like Earth. But that's not what they found. Because the probes, when they landed on the surface of Venus, only lasted a few minutes because they found out the temperature was hot enough to melt lead. And as they began to speculate why this would be so on the planet Venus, they realized that there was something called the greenhouse effect. Now, this was found out in the late 60s and early 70s. And the greenhouse effect is basically that the warmth from the planet gets trapped by carbon in the upper atmosphere, and it causes the temperature to continually rise. So again, this is not a new concept, but for some reason, it's a concept that has begun to be rejected. Over 90% of scientists around the world agree that the climate is changing, that we are having a detrimental effect on the life of our planet. And yet, there's a great number of deniers of this information. You know, the 70s were filled with an ecological revolution. People began to understand that we couldn't breathe the air safely. We couldn't drink our water. I remember as a young man being in Cleveland and watching the river burn there in Cleveland where my brother lived. So regulations were put in place and things were changed, and the water began to become cleaner and the air became cleaner. And it's not perfect yet, but through those regulations, we've been able to make life better. But now we find ourselves in a time when those regulations are being destroyed. And we're going back into days where our air and our water is becoming untenable. The idea that evolution, we've been in a battle for several years of evolution versus intelligent design. Now, again, this is no new battle. This has been going on for years. If it had not been, we wouldn't have had things like the Scopes monkey trial. But intelligent design is just a new word for creationism, and there's a battle in that. And although the evidence for evolutionary theory is put forward by Darwin, it's irrefutable. It exists. One of my favorite examples of this is a moth in Britain. The moth itself for years was a white moth, and it continued to exist as a white moth because it spent most of its time on the white bark of birch trees in Britain until the Industrial Revolution. And as mankind began to pour more smoke and soot and things out into the air as the manufacturing took off, the birch trees began to darken because of the soot. And therefore, the birds were now able to see the white moths they couldn't really see before, and the only ones that survived were dark. So the species became a darker form of moth. And then, as I said, in the 70s, with regulation things, the air began to clean. You know, scrubbers and filters were put on those smokestacks, and the birch trees went back to white. And we saw the evolution of the moth go then from a dark variety back to a light variety because it was the lighter ones that could survive. And how many of you, hold up your hands, how many of you can wiggle your ears? 1, 2, 3, about 3 or 4 people say they can wiggle their ears. Well, let me tell you, you're an example of evolution, because the vestigial muscles that allow you to wiggle your ears are something that's disappearing from the human race. It won't be very long until you'll no longer be able to wiggle your ears. No human will be able to. And if it's a vestigial muscle that we have in relation to horses. It's the same muscle that exists in horses. You know how horses flick their ears to get rid of the flies? They use a particular muscle to do that. And all mammals have that, but in some species, it's beginning to fade away as it is in humans. There's a whole lot of examples of vestigial muscles that are really interesting if you want to read about them. But the question of evolution versus intelligent design is not really a question. But yet today we have a huge part of our population that just simply doesn't believe in natural evolution. And if you look at the disarray that we've experienced in the last few months with COVID-19, you begin to understand that as our leaders and our society more and more begin to turn their faces away from the light of science, that we wind up getting into situations in which it's very difficult for us to cope with things that we have to use science as our basis for dealing with. And that's really been evident in the last few months, at least to me. I think we've entered a period, I remember not too long ago, watching a half-hour argument between Newt Gingrich and a commentator on Fox News, arguing about the idea that feelings are more important than facts. And that was Newt Gingrich's position, that feelings mean more than do facts. And more we've seen part of our society turn away from factual-based decision-making into kind of knee-jerk reactions to whatever was the current feeling was. And I don't think we can allow that to happen. Those who see the light, those who understand the facts, those that understand the truth that we have, must always rage against the darkness. You have to use your voice in whatever platform you find. Don't let the deniers of the light diminish its illumination. It's going to be a really sad day in our society if we ever get to the point of re-entering those dark ages, when there is no new explorations, there is no new scientific discoveries, there are no new questions being asked and answers being found. And unfortunately, I see our society slowly slipping away. Now, we're not anywhere near entering that period of time now, but we are in the beginning phases. And if you, like I, find that that is a serious thing to think about, a frightening prospect, then use your voice, whatever platform you have. You know, rage against that darkness so that the light can shine. One other quote from space I'd like to share with you this morning was from the astronomer professor to John when he was a student. He says, "Always remember, John, that you and I live on a minor planet attached to a minor star in a far edge of a minor galaxy. We live here briefly, and then we're gone. We're forgotten. And one day those galaxies will be gone as well. The only morality that makes sense is to do something useful with the brief time that we're allotted. And I suggest that one thing that we can do is to rage against the darkness. Because an age is called dark, not because the light fails to shine, but because the people refuse to see it." Thank you very much. And I might share with you one final thing. If a lot of people think that because Michener wrote this in a novel, he made it up about the whole supernova. That's not right. There actually was an article published in the History of Astrophysics that talks about the fact that they could not find any references. They found 8 different references to astrological or astronomical rather events that had happened, but none of them correlated with the Taurus supernova. And if you want proof that the Taurus supernova actually happened, then behind me you'll see, let me duck out of the way, that's a picture of the Crab Nebula, which is the remnants of the supernova of 1054. Again, thank you very much this morning.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That was absolutely, I mean, I knew when I had recommended you that you would really give us a really great presentation, and you really, really did. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed that. My internet went out, or I was able to, but I had told. If Dawn could let me be the co-host again, what I'd like to do is mute everyone, and then after everyone raise their hand, I'd like to ask a question.
Are you outside, Amy? Because it sounds like wind blowing.
Somebody got to be somebody else's mic.
Yeah, it's someone else. Well, that to be able to mute everyone, but without being the co-host, I can't do that. I don't have that capability right now. Hey Don, are you there?
Well, he's muted.
Yeah.
Co-host. Amy, I just made you.
Oh, thank you, Don. I'm going to mute all, and then if everyone could use their raise hand, and I will right now. Linda's going to be the first one, but I'm going to mute all first. And I don't. Okay. Okay, Linda.
Unmute Dennis.
What happens to the raging? How long can you keep the raging high before something happens to that and it starts to fade?
Well, this is going to be a simplistic sounding answer, but I think you rage as long as you need to rage. I think that, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. That especially in the current circumstances that we exist, and I don't want to get into a lot of politics today, although I certainly could, as Amy can attest. I think that you whenever you see a situation where we begin to slide backwards in society, in the progress of society, whether we're talking about social progress, scientific progress, whatever it is, I think that you have to be vocal. You have to be willing to speak up. You have to be willing to try and convince others that this is not the way to go. And it can be tiring. I understand exactly what you're saying, Linda. It can be very tiring. But the simplest answer.
Could it be a larger part of a very large cycle that we really don't have control over?
I think it's part of a cycle. I'm not sure that it's not that we don't have control over it. What's happening in today's society, and it kind of amazes me, but if you think about it, it's pervasive in our society, is that the minority is the most vocal. The number of people who feel the way that I've talked about today is a minority number of people in this country, but they have the loudest voice. And the majority of people who don't agree with this, who have the largest voice, are for the most part silent.
Well, that's part of the old objections, though, that the elites had the control.
And it is an old objection, and it's a continuing objection, and it will continue to exist so long as we allow it to, and as long as the majority is silent. As long as the majority of people who should be voting aren't voting, and only something like 37% of registered voters voted in the 2016 election, we won't have change. The change will not happen as the majority of people think it should. So, and I think that's why people like you and I, who are people at least that share most of our beliefs, have to be vocal, because the minute we become silent, things begin to really slip for the worst. I'm not sure that, you know, there are forces that we have a great deal of difficulty in fighting against, but the truth of the matter is every major social experience that we've had that's been positive in the history of this country has come from a grassroots level. We've never had any progress happen that it didn't come from the grassroots, because the majority of people would scream out for that, and it's not always the majority. Sometimes it's the loud minority, as we're finding today.
Okay, the next person is Wanda. So let me just find you, Wanda, and I will unmute you.
And I'm not sure I agree.
That's okay. You're allowed not to agree. That's one of the great things about being in this country.
Okay, I had to unmute myself because I had muted myself, I guess. Well, I just want to give you a little example of one of the things that I've debated with myself to do or not to do. And one of the little things is to comment on people's use of masks or no masks. And most of you know that I was an infection control practitioner for about 40 years. So this is my area of expertise. And I think, like you suggested, we should be wearing, well, I don't know if you suggested, but we should be wearing them in public when we have exposure to other people, for them and for us. And and so I decided that kindly, I am commenting to people at some points. Yesterday I was in the computer store and all the customers came in with masks on, but the guy working there wasn't wearing a mask. And when he was alone, then everybody else had left, I asked him and challenged him a little bit about why he wasn't wearing a mask. I said, you are actually the most risk person here. All of us are coming in from outside, from somewhere, and you could get this disease. And then you can give it to all the other people. And he said, and his comment was, they aren't making me do it. So unfortunately, that's a common thing. If you don't make me do it, then I don't have to. And so I just gently tried to say, you know, I bet you could wear a mask if you chose to, and maybe you should, and left it at that. Another guy was in there with a mask on, and he kept touching the front of it. He was fiddling with it because they're uncomfortable. You're not used to wearing them. And so when we had a couple minutes, and I very gently said, if you don't mind my commenting, you really should not be touching the front of your mask. Use the straps, pull it by the top, but your front is contaminated if anybody has talked to you. So don't get your hands contaminated. It's just like touching your face. And he was very appropriate. He said, I appreciate your candor and your comment, but I'm supposing I'll run into some people who will tell me to shut up, but I'll probably still keep doing it. That's all. And that's my one little thing.
Well, I think something else we need to realize too is that, I mentioned the fact that right now in this country, the minority view on a lot of things has a larger voice. And I think a lot of that has to do because of the 24-hour news cycle. I worked in TV for about 27 years, and I can tell you the oldest phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, is really true. And therefore, the people that are making the biggest fuss, those that are causing the most confusion and chaos, are usually the ones that are featured. And that's why I think one large part of why that minority view has become so loud. In talking about masks, I was watching as things began to open up and they were starting, some areas were having protests. There was a gentleman in one of the beach areas in Florida who was doing a report and he was wearing his mask. And as he's doing his report, somebody walked out without a mask and said to him, "Take off that mask, you a-hole," and continue to walk on. And I thought, yeah, that's a civil society that we have, isn't it?
I had someone that coughed in my direction without a mask. Now what I'm going to do is John Ivins was the one who raised his hand, and then Connie did. So I will mute Wanda and unmute John.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was in a discussion on chat this morning with my nephew. He's about, excuse me, 30 years of age, or actually about 35. And he was asking me what I thought our future would look like. And I brought up the Dust Bowl as an example of something that's already happened to us that might be like what we're going to face with climate change. And he asked back, oh, the Dust Bowl, well, that's where they didn't rotate crops. That's all fixed now. And I asked him to Google the Dust Bowl, and my understanding of the Dust Bowl is that it basically was that too much wheat or annual crops were planted in an environment that just doesn't have the rainfall to support that environment. And there are periodic droughts in the high plains, and those are just a part of nature. But if large portions of the acreage there is planted with wheat or similar annual crops, those crops die in a drought, in a normal drought, and the topsoil just turns to dust. Hence, more the solution, if any, that has occurred, resulting in those areas now being somewhat more fertile, is that they've dug a lot of wells. Well, the Ogallala aquifer is now receding. So that problem really hasn't been solved. But a lot of people with very good educations think of the Dust Bowl in simple, shallow terms. And they don't understand the degree of calamity that resulted from it and what actually caused it. And when your talk on the Dark Ages brings that thought to my mind. Thank you. Do I need a question? Do I need to give a question before?
No, I personally think you're absolutely right. What I was doing was looking to see if I could find a copy. I read a book a couple of years ago about the Dust Bowl, and it really, the Dust Bowl happened because of ignorance and policy. Exactly what you're talking about, and it's the same thing that we're having to deal with today. So yeah, I think, and a lot of it's not only the agricultural, environmental conditions that were causing the Dust Bowl, but think of the social upheaval. You know, those of you who have read The Grapes of Wrath understand that it really caused a lot of problems. I think Joseph has a comment he wants to make.
I think I was next, I believe. But
Oh, okay.
that's okay. Gordon wants to make a comment about that, and then I have something I wanted to ask too.
Actually, the roots of the Dust Bowl preceded the actual event. When they wiped out the bison and the megafauna and the native flora that lived out in the Midwest, the bison used to keep that soil tamped down during their migrations, and also kept it fertilized. And they were able to subsist on those dry land vegetation. the government gives everybody 40 acres and a mule, and out they go, and they kill off the bison and they plow the soil up. And of course, the seasonal winds just blew everything away. It was a combination of thinking, because there was adequate rainfall when they started, that it was always like that, but they didn't have the long range record to see that this was cyclical. The other thing, I read a Michener novel called Chesapeake. I don't know if you've read that, but it involves a fictional island in the Chesapeake Bay, and had people living on it, and wealthy people, and it was over time it slowly eroded away until one big storm that was finally gone. We're seeing that at Tangier Island right now, which is in the bay in Virginia. It's down to about 700 acres, and they're losing their island, they're losing their town, they're losing their livelihood, and yet they still don't believe it's global warming and sea level rise causing this, and they're still all unbelievers. I explain people working so adamantly to maintain that they are correct and everybody else is wrong. And part of the reason that everybody on the right seems so loud is because when people fall off a cliff, they scream.
That's true. Yeah, I've read several accounts of that island that is slowly disappearing, and it's not the only thing. We've actually seen a lot of landmass that is on the shores around the world are beginning to be really affected by rising sea levels. So the evidence is there. I mean, it's obvious if you look for it. You have to not, to go back to Michener's quote, you have to not see the light to be able to deny it. So
yeah, how do you deny what's right in front of your face?
Absolutely, but it seems easy for some people to do.
Yeah.
Now, and my question was, you're talking about not getting enough voters out. What can we do, or do you have recommendations for people like us that I know one group I'm working with to try to get out votes. But are there, I mean, you could even email some of them to me if you have good ideas. I mean, you may have some good ideas about who would be the people to contact about trying to get people out to vote.
Well, I know there are a number of organizations. The first one that comes to mind is the League of Women Voters.
Yeah.
They do a really exceptional job of trying to get out and get people registered to vote. And that's really about all you can do on a technical side is to register people. I'm the vice president of the Volusia Flagler ACLU, and I know that we spend, anytime we're out in public, we have voter registration that we try to do for anybody that we can. The problem is that's really all you can do. Once they're registered, then how do you motivate them to actually get out of the house and go vote? One of the things that I find most disturbing right now about what's happening politically is this rail against mail-in voting, which makes no sense at all. I mean, mail-in voting has been used by the military and people all over the country for years. There is no proof of any, irregularities in the way that it's handled. So it is, and that would be a way, I think, if we voted by mail, I think we'd have more people participating, because unfortunately we live in a pretty lazy society. People don't want to get off their butts and go do anything. If they have to exert an effort, and sometimes going and voting does. I know that, one of the things that we've experienced is a reduction of the number of places for early voting in the state of Florida, especially here in the central Florida, and that we had cases in Volusia County where people were fainting. They were outside waiting in line for such a long period of time. Well, you let a few of those stories get out and people won't be waiting in line anymore. They just simply won't vote. So somehow we have to influence our lawmakers, and this is it's a Herculean task, but we have to influence our lawmakers to make voting easier. And the current administration seems to want to do everything it can to make voting harder, especially for certain groups of society. So until we're able to do that, really, speak with your friends, speak with those people that are around you. If you find groups of people that really aren't interested in voting, and explain to them why they need to vote. You can be influential in this in your own circles of influence. And then registering people to vote, I think, is a really good thing. But understanding that registering someone to vote doesn't mean they're going to vote. But if we can educate people to understand how important it is, I think then, yeah, we should be doing that. But there are a number of organizations that work on voter registration and trying to get out the vote every year. They're not hard to find. But the League of Women Voters, the ACLU to a point does. We're a very nonpartisan but very political organization. And we tend to do a lot of work in that area as well.
Okay, thank you. I noticed that Don is, well, just one sec. Don is the host, and he had his hand up. We're also using like the hand up functionality, that it's easier for me to do it that way rather than, I don't know who iPad 2 is. I'd really rather people use that capability so I can have it where the people, I want to do it first in, first out.
That doesn't.
Don wanted to ask a question.
The reason it doesn't show, I can't use that function because I'm listed as a host, and it won't allow me to use that hand raising function. So if you want,
right, and that's why I thought.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's why I saw that you were raising your hand, and that's why I put you in next into asking a question.
Okay, I just have a comment. Dennis, that was absolutely spectacular. That was a splendid presentation you gave, and I want to thank you for that. I just want to say one thing about evolution and about some of the things that are happening right now. As I understand evolution myself, and I understand it, and I understand creationism as being part of it, I understand that everything is connected. Everything in the universe is connected. That means if one thing changes, it changes everything else, and the connectivity is mutual. That means that changes are taking place and have been taking place at least since the Big Bang, 13.5 billion years ago, probably beyond that, but we don't know how to deal with that, even conceptually. But the thing is, everything is constantly changing. In other words, creation began then and is still ongoing and will continue virtually forever because things are changing. Everything changes through interaction. Modern science is dealing with that through what is now referred to as complex systems theory, which allows these interactions to cause amplification. In understanding complex systems theory, one of the simple concepts they start out with is talking about something called a resonant triad. Now, a resonant triad would be the convergence of three mutually interactive phenomena. And in the triad, if there's phenomena A, B, and C, an increase in A amplifies B, an increase in B amplifies C, increase in C amplifies A, and so on. This is positive feedback. It's unstable, but it leads to catastrophic change, and sometimes in a very abrupt and illogical way. It seems that right now we are on the brink of one of these resonant triads involving the convergence of three absolutely terrifying situations. One of them is a pandemic, one of them is climate change, and the other is ignorant and inept leadership. And they're mutually amplifying each other.
Yeah, Don, I agree with everything you said. I think that it's an oxymoronic statement in some ways, but it is the most honestly true statement ever made, that the only constant in the universe is change. And that evolution is nothing more than change. So evolution is constant in the universe, and everything evolves. Think about your life and your opinions and your ideas and the way you think about things. Have they not evolved in your lifetime? Everything evolves, and to deny evolution is to deny the mechanics of the universe in every aspect of the universe. So thanks, Don. That was great.
Thanks. It looks like iPad 2. I'm really sorry, I don't know your name. And then after that, Dave and Pam had their hand up. So I will allow iPad 2 to unmute.
I mean, the whole thing is glorious too. The unrolling the creatures, not be able to go to a museum and see those things and marvel at them. They will not believe it.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, it's Bob Benner. How are you?
I'm sorry, Bob. I just, I think what we all need to do is have our names on there to make it easier. I do apologize. I don't know everyone's name.
Okay, I think it's just picking up what I called my iPad. I'll try and figure out a way to make it a different name. I've had some dark thoughts about this pandemic, even though I am in Eden and really not in the danger that I might be if I were home back on Long Island, where the pandemic is a lot worse. I put something up on Facebook, and I was thinking about your white birch and moths and evolution. And one of the words that I used on my little screed on Facebook, that, by the way, blew up within my group, was the word culling. Culling has two definitions. There's one is to kill. You would cull, I'm a farmer, you'd cull plants that were too many in a row or something like that. And the other is sorting. And I began to think about how these people who don't seem to follow science, who have these cockamamie ideas about the way things are moving along, and I have plenty of students that I follow on my Facebook, and some of them are, one this morning was talking about people who are wearing masks as being, you know, not doing the right thing. I just wonder what you might think about the concept of that evolution happening with these ignorant people and their likelihood of being quote unquote sorted or culled.
I think my own personal view on that is it's very possible that may be what's happening. Any group of organisms, whether you're talking about grasshoppers or wild animals or human beings, reach a certain level of consumption and a certain level of use of the environment around them until they overuse it, and then the population crashes. That's what it's called, the population crash. And I'm not sure we're not experiencing that somewhat today. You know, this is not the first pandemic, obviously, but if you look at the history of pandemics, and of course you can only go back so far because they're only researched back so far, but they are occurring more frequently. We are getting more infectious diseases that are affecting larger groups of people all the time. Could that be part of a population crash? It very well could. You know, we will only be able to abuse the environment and our planet for so long before Mother Nature starts taking revenge and we begin to crash as a population. So I think, I don't think there's anything particularly ill-conceived in that idea that you put forward. Not that I'm an expert by any means, believe me. Amy, Joseph has had his hand up for about a week now, so. wonder if we've lost